Hi, everybody. You know, we often inherit our history and our traditions without really knowing where they come from. Today, we're at the Cathedral in Coventry, learning about the history of this place. And that's because this week I've come to England to travel, to walk through the footsteps of John Wesley, to see where he walked and what he learned and how he became the pastor and the preacher that he was, and see how that sparked a movement that spread across the entire world. But you know, the story about this story isn't really just about John Wesley. It's about grace. The grace that connected him to God, the grace that helped him grow, and the grace that sent him out into the world to make the world his parish. And it's that same grace that's available to us. To understand that story, though, we have to begin where Wesley's story begins. Well, here we are. We're in Epworth, England, at St. Andrew's Church. This was a church that they began building it in the 900s. It's over 1,200 years old. This was the church that Samuel Wesley, the father of John Wesley, was the pastor for decades. This was the church where John Wesley and Charles Wesley had their first communion and were baptized. We just got to have a communion service together using the chalice that was given to this church in 1706. We got to use that same chalice for communion this morning. The connections that we're making between each other and with the history of John Wesley is just amazing. We're learning to connect our faith to the history that is here. And John Wesley learned his faith at the knee of his mother, Susanna Wesley. And that's how he connected with things. Susanna was an amazing teacher for him. Good Shepherd, with our vision statement, has connect to be the first word. Connect, grow, serve. Connect is what we're doing here. Connect is what we do at Good Shepherd, because discipleship begins with someone helping us to connect to God's grace. So this is the rectory for St. Andrew's Church, where Samuel and Susanna Wesley raised their children. When I said that John learned his faith at the knee of Susanna, this was where it happened. This was the house they built after the original rectory burned, and John Wesley was famously called, it was said that he was a brand plucked from the fire that burned the previous home. This is where he really learned his faith from his mother, Susanna. Oxford University is actually made up of 43 colleges. 36 of them are chartered colleges, and of those 36, Christ Church College is one of the most impressive. It was originally started by Cardinal Wolsey during Henry VIII's reign as King of England. There's a lot of history here. Part of that history is that John and Charles Wesley both went to school here and got their degrees and became priests of the Anglican Church here. In fact, when Charles came, He was, of course, John's younger brother. And he came and he said, you know what, I think there's too many distractions. How can I be a better student? And that's when John worked with him, and they joined with some friends like George Whitefield. This is a group that worked together to create a study plan and a time of prayer daily, a disciplined lifestyle that because of who they were, they became known as the Holy Club. This was the group that, because of that disciplined lifestyle, were actually called Methodists by other students in the school. And that was actually a derogatory term, but they held on to it because it spoke to who they were and what they were doing. But even with this disciplined lifestyle making such a difference in their lives, John Wesley knew that there was more than that needed for a life. So this is the new room in Bristol, England. This was the first building that was actually built by and for Methodists. John Wesley built it at the behest of George Whitefield, his friend and part of the Holy Club. They decided that they needed a place to gather as Methodists, and so this is where they built it. This is where they came. This is the place that John Wesley preached so adamantly against slavery and worked so hard at it. But this was really the crucible of what became his understanding of Methodism, what his understanding became of theology and the Wesleyan way. You see, this is where he created the small groups, the classes, the societies, where they were expected to show up. They were expected to grow in their faith, just like our vision statement, connect, grow, serve. This was where they began the growth and where they started to really become disciples of Jesus Christ. Because at the end of the day, conversion is not the finish line. It's just the beginning. That's when we need to grow into the disciples and follow a discipleship plan. That's what John Wesley created here at the new room. This was a place also that became a school. It was a dispensary for medications. It was a food bank. It was not just a place for church attendance, but for discipleship and growth in their faith. But at the same time, John Wesley still knew there was something missing. In 1738, John Wesley, he was already a pastor. He was a missionary. He was helping other people find their own faith. But still, he was struggling with the head knowledge versus the heart reality of his faith. He was unsure. May 24th of that year, he didn't want to go to a society meeting on Aldersgate Street that day, but reluctantly he went. The person who was leading the service that day decided to read the Martin Luther's preface to the book of Romans. This is not a big passionate writing or anything, and yet John Wesley found that his life was changed completely, and so was the world. It was when he wrote later in his journal that I felt my heart strangely warmed. He discovered at that point, late in life, that grace isn't something you earn through discipline and ministry, but grace is a gift freely given by our God. I think many Christians need an Aldersgate moment in their life, because real growth happens when grace moves from something we understand to something we truly feel and live out and believe. Once Wesley experienced that grace personally, he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. When John Wesley built the new room, he had a very specific purpose in mind. He knew he needed to have a space for worship and for ministry to happen. He was adamant that it be a proper space, and that was necessary for what they wanted to do. But after his Aldersgate experience, his ministry changed dramatically. Churches, he understood that their mission doesn't end at the church door, but it goes on. He needed to be able to reach the workers, the miners, the marginalized. He needed to go outside and meet people where they were. That's when he came up with what ended up being called field preaching. He started that, and there were stories about him going, preaching to the miners as they were coming out off of their shift, and streaks running down their face as they cried. They were so moved by the sermon. His willingness to start preaching outside served him very well sometime after that, as the Anglican Church started to refuse to allow him to preach in their churches. It was said that he would go to the church in Epworth where he was raised, where his father had been a pastor for decades and where he was buried. And he would stand on the grave of his father and say, "They won't let me in the building, but this belongs to me." And he would preach to people outside the church while the parish priest would preach inside. And of course, John would have larger crowds than they did inside. But even through all of this, John realized and understood that reaching people, it is important and it makes a difference, but that people needed a place to belong. When Wesley first came to London, he got access to an old cannon factory, and that was the first meeting house here in London. It was called the Foundry. You may hear different worship spaces called the Foundry, and that's where that name comes from. But eventually that didn't work as well, and so John came here and built what is known as Wesley's Chapel. It's on City Street in downtown London. He built it in 1778. And it's known as the Mother Church of World Methodism. The new room was all about proper worship and discipline. At the same time, Wesley's Chapel was all about the people called Methodists. Here is where Wesley created structures that helped people discover their gifts, care for one another, and serve their communities. That concept ties to the Good Shepherd vision of connect, serve, and grow. Both show the real rhythm of Christian discipleship. It's how we understand that everyone has a role. It is wonderful to see us continuing a vision from our very beginnings. Sitting here across from Wesley's grave, I am reminded that every life comes to an end. And I think it's important to remember that John Wesley's greatest achievements were not the structures that he built, but the people that he helped become disciples. When Wesley died in 1791, Methodism did not die with him because ordinary people had learned to connect with Christ, grow in grace, and serve their neighbors. The question is not whether John Wesley's movement and legacy will continue, but rather how will we continue in it. You know, over this week I've seen where Methodism began. I've walked through the home where faith was nurtured. I've stood where small groups were formed, and I've visited the place where Wesley's heart was strangely warmed. And I've visited all of these places as the movement moved across England to the New World. And what strikes me most is this: the movement was never about Wesley. It was always about grace. Grace that connects us to God, grace that helps us grow and sends us out to serve others. And that same grace is still at work today. Here at Good Shepherd, our vision is simple: connect, grow, serve. And as Wesley would remind us, the Christian faith is not something we merely believe, it is something we live. Amen.